carry attack from something from us. Where was that? Where were they attacking? Where did they go after?
They were attacking the German Zeppelin sheds at a Zeppelin base. And it was interesting because the biggest threat that the Zeppelins posed to the British was they were doing, the Zeppelins were the long-range reconnaissance arm for the German Navy. And so the British Navy was very stressed about the Zeppelins. And so their very first carrier airstrike was against the Zeppelin hangars, and they destroyed 2 of them in their sheds. Now, I want to go back to the story. The question you just asked me about. I want to mention Glenn Curtiss. Glenn Curtiss actually did a lot of flying boats during the war. The only American designed and built aircraft that actually saw combat were Curtiss aircraft, flying boats, and not only the HS-1L and HS-2L single-engine flying boats that were patrol planes. And as a former patrol pilot, I can appreciate that. But he also did twin-engine, bigger twin-engine flying boats, and they worked with the British at Felixstowe. And so the Curtiss boats then, how would I put it? We're doing a book that will be out next year about the Felixstowe flying boats and their Curtiss predecessors. And these aircraft were into anti-submarine warfare in the North Sea, something I can relate to. And they also, I showed you the one photograph of the Brandenburg floatplane fighter. They had epic combats with these 2-seat floatplane fighters over the North Sea during the war. There's all kinds of fun stuff, and a lot of this is mentioned in the book with more photographs and all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to give you a bit more about Curtiss. Curtiss didn't do fighters at that time. It was flying boats and patrol planes.
Very interesting, the book, The Millionaires Unit, if you want to read about the volunteer unit from Yale that created the first American submarine unit. Question?
Just a compliment, really. I've seen a lot of the photographs that you displayed. The way you clean those up, the crispness and smartness, it's really impressive. How did you do that?
Photoshop. Well, okay. Let me. I work with a fellow up in Seattle who has his black belt in Photoshop, and he did his first pass on these to get the contrast and exposure correct and brightness, and then I take them and I get all the dings out of them I possibly can. Sometimes I spend 45 minutes to an hour on one photo. Okay, the book has almost 550 photos. It gives you that's just the graphics preparation, but it's critical.
In the back.
Did Alberto Santos Dumont have anything to do with the military planes?
I don't know the answer to your question. Okay, I just don't know the answer to your question. He was, I think, a pre-war aviator that, in this sense, all of the pre-war aviators, whether they were went on to become fighter pilots or not, created the aviation industry and helped mature the technology, not only the technology of building and designing and building airplanes, but also how do you fly them? Not just the mechanics of flying the airplane, but all of the surrounding infrastructure, airports and information that you need before you fly from one place to another. So he was a well-known pilot before the war. He's one of many that created the technology and the infrastructure necessary for then the specialized fighter aviation to be part of, to go from.
Joe?
Before the all-metal plane, presumably the planes had a wood frame. Do you know anything about the sources of that kind of flexible, strong wood in Europe? In America, the Pacific Northwest spruce forest had an interesting history of labor problems that had to be solved once the United States got into it.
Well, the U.S. Army took over the spruce industry and expanded it greatly for exactly that purpose, to get the right kind of wood for the airplanes. Now, some of the companies, I know more about the German aircraft than the others, but the German company AEG, their aircraft were metal welded steel tube framing. And in Fokker, his fuselages were welded steel tube. The wings were made of wood. But most of the aircraft were wood construction. It's wood, wire, and fabric. And the right wood was critical.
To answer the question on Dumas, there's a novel program called Wings of Madness, and it talks about Dumas, how he was anti-war, and basically went crazy when World War I happened, because he was so anti-war.
Yeah. Although really the only market for airplanes before World War I, other than people who, like him, who just wanted to fly, was the military. I mean, the only possible commercial value of an airplane was military. There was no other commercial value.
Were there any female pilots, even non-military?
Yes, there were. And in fact, in Russia during World War I, there were women who flew combat missions. And I published a book in 1994, I think it was, about the Imperial Russian Air Service, where we actually have a couple of chapters on it.
Were there any Russian improvements in airfighter planes?
Okay. In World War I and prior to it, Russia had a very minimal industry, and they were not able to build enough aircraft engines. They built just over 1,500 airplane engines during the entire war. Basically, most of their designs were very primitive, and I think the one really successful design was not a fighter plane, but it was the four-engine Sikorsky Ilya-Muromets aircraft. And if you look at all the other airplanes, most of their airplanes were either purchased from the French, or they were Nieuports, and others built, French aircraft designs built under license in Russia. They had some Voisins and some Farmans. And so the Russian aviation industry itself was primitive, particularly the aero engine industry was very, very primitive. And they struggled greatly. So their technology came primarily from France.
How vulnerable were the Zeppelins to fighter attack?
Okay, let's talk. This is fun. One of the aspects that I did not have time to cover in detail were the anti-Zeppelin fighters and this sort of thing. I showed you one. If you in the book we covered a little bit more, but if you look at these anti-Zeppelin aircraft, they all had gunners at the top because they all knew that the Zeppelin was going to be above them. Okay, basically early in the war, the Zeppelins were almost as fast as the fighter or the planes. And so if the Zeppelin, saw the airplane trying to approach it to attack, which they did, then they would drop the ballast and they just pop up, and they could outclimb the airplanes easily and had a higher ceiling in the airplanes. Now, airplane technology advanced much more quickly than Zeppelin technology, so the German response to that was bigger Zeppelins that could go higher, what they called the height climbers. And by the end of the war, they had Zeppelins that could fly at over 20,000 feet. And it was very, very tough for only the best aircraft could reach them. Okay. Does that answer your question?
How did they breathe at 20,000 feet in 1918?
Yeah, that was tough. Okay. The atmospheric pressure at 18,000 feet is half of what it is at sea level, at 18,000 feet. That means that half the atmosphere is at 18,000 feet and below. 20,000 feet is just above that. It's very, very tough. What they would do is they would often carry little bottles of oxygen with them, and they didn't have oxygen masks that we know today. They would just sip it. And it was, okay, if you were a Zeppelin crewman, you're flying at night, you're at 20,000 feet, somewhere over England, you hoped, 'cause that's where you're supposed to be bombing. It was probably 50 or below zero or more. And if you had to, had to go out and sew up a rip in the fabric, they would put a safety harness on you and lower you over the side from a hatch at the top, and you had to sew that up. Think about that.
All this for 3 marks a day.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely insane. What those folks did, as a matter of course, we would go, you did what? That's crazy. That's why I'm so, one of the things I like about this old airplane stuff and old aviation stuff was the people involved. My gosh, the courage that they had and what they were willing to do on a daily basis is just stunning to me. Their courage and fortitude.
Well, let's have one more.